Okay. All right. So this is essentially section 3, all right, which is basically going to try to lead us into chapter 4, which chapter 4 is strictly on the amendments and that. So when we look at the Constitution, we talk about articles and amendments and such. All right. When we talk about the articles are the kind of the original. That's the original Constitution. All right. Amendments. When we say amendment, let me go back there. An amendment is basically a change. All right, a written change to the Constitution. All right, and so that's outlined in Article 5. There's 7 total articles. When the framers of the Constitution initially left Philadelphia, that's what the Constitution was. Remember, amendments. The changes were kind of speared by that dispute between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were the ones who insisted on changing the Constitution, but adding what we refer to as the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. All right. All in all, there's 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which, when you think about it over the 200-plus year history here, that's not a lot. All right. The last amendment added, the 27th Amendment, was added in 1992. All right. So it's going on about 30 years since we've had a change, if you will, to the U.S. Constitution. All right. Now, the reason that we have such limited change here is kind of the framers of the Constitution almost kind of structured as that. I want to play this TED Ed video that kind of talks a little bit about this, and I'm kind of do some terms here that we'll kind of throw in.
When it was ratified in 1789, the U.S. Constitution didn't just institute a government by the people. It provided a way for the people to alter the Constitution itself. And yet, of the nearly 11,000 amendments proposed in the centuries since, only 27 have succeeded as of 2016. So what is it that makes the Constitution so hard to change? In short, its creators. The founders of the United States were trying to create a unified country from 13 different colonies, which needed assurance that their agreements couldn't be easily undone. So here's what they decided. For an amendment to even be proposed, it must receive a 2/3 vote of approval in both houses of Congress, or a request from 2/3 of state legislatures to call a national convention. And that's just the first step. To actually change the Constitution, the amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of all states. To do this, each state can either have its legislature vote on the amendment, or it can hold a separate ratification convention with delegates elected by voters. The result of such high thresholds is that today, the American Constitution is quite static. Most other democracies pass amendments every couple of years. The US, on the other hand, hasn't passed one since 1992. At this point, you may wonder how any amendments manage to pass at all. The first 10, known as the Bill of Rights, include some of America's most well-known freedoms, such as the freedom of speech and the right to a fair trial. These were passed all at once to resolve some conflicts from the original Constitutional Convention. Years later, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, as well as the 14th and 15th Amendments, only passed after a bloody civil war. Ratifying amendments has also become harder as the country has grown larger and more diverse. The first ever proposed amendment, a formula to assign congressional representatives, was on the verge of ratification in the 1790s. However, as more and more states joined the Union, the number needed to reach the 3/4 mark increased as well, leaving it unratified to this day. Today, there are many suggested amendments, including outlawing the burning of the flag, limiting congressional terms, or even repealing the Second Amendment. While many enjoy strong support, their likelihood of passing is slim. Americans today are the most politically polarized since the Civil War, making it nearly impossible to reach a broad consensus. In fact, the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia once calculated that due to America's representative system of government, it could take as little as 2% of the total population to block an amendment. Of course, the simplest solution would be to make the Constitution easier to amend by lowering the thresholds required for proposal and ratification. That, however, would require its own amendment. Instead, Historical progress has mainly come from the US Supreme Court, which has expanded its interpretation of existing constitutional laws to keep up with the times. Considering that Supreme Court justices are unelected and serve for life once appointed, this is far from the most democratic option. Interestingly, the founders themselves may have foreseen this problem early on. In a letter to James Madison, Thomas Jefferson wrote that laws should expire every 19 years, rather than having to be changed or repealed, since every political process is full of obstacles that distort the will of the people. Although he believed that the basic principles of the Constitution would endure, he stressed that the earth belongs to the living and not to the dead.
So, like it says there, the process itself, the kind of structure itself, kind of creates this kind of like the limit on change here, right? So, like the video said, how an amendment is kind of proposed, goes by two ways. One, Congress can propose amendment by a 2/3 vote in both houses, or state legislatures, 2/3 of all states can ask Congress to call a convention. Those are the two ways that have been done. I believe the second one is generally the one that has been used the most. All right. And so again, this is kind of the idea of 2/3. I mean, that's a more than a majority, right? Can't just have what we call a simple majority. And like I was saying, like the video was saying, like today, it's kind of being played out right now. Like right now, there's the Senate's holding a hearing on the proposed Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, and you're going to see that essentially that in a lot of those hearings how that's played out. Where you kind of 2/3 right now, it's going to be hard to get 2/3 of Congress to kind of pass an amendment for you're going to get people to kind of agree upon this. All right. And then for ratification, for passage, for it to be officially kind of added to the Constitution, similar. However, it boosts up to 3/4, which makes that even more of a consensus. So for ratification, 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 3/4 of the states have a convention that pass through a convention, which I believe, like the other one, this is the one that's been used the most, the second one. This is stated in Article 7, the last article to the Constitution. So the framers knew that over time things would probably have to be added to it, right? But here you have certain people, like the video mentioned Antonin Scalia, who was Supreme Court Justice who passed away in 2016. Scalia is part of a kind of a philosophy referred to as constructionists. These are people that believe in the kind of like the absolute kind of letter of the Constitution, that kind of believe that the Constitution, as it was written, is how it should be, kind of basically how kind of laws should be passed, how it should be intended. Right? There isn't a whole lot of kind of movement or allowing to kind of change with the times and that type of kind of philosophy, right? And even somebody like Jefferson was kind of question that type of kind of concept of thinking. All right. So like I said, these are basically it's difficult. All right. So that's why we have almost like 30 years since the last one. And the 27th Amendment was basically over pay raises for Congress. All right. The idea was that they couldn't get a pay raise initially until after like an election. Now, there's also something in there with the idea to the video talks about repealing the Second Amendment, which is, kind of a political hot button. But it's the same way how a amendment is proposed. To repeal it, you have to have an amendment as well. All right. So a repeal just basically means to cancel out. So we've had one amendment that's been canceled out. All right. That's the 18th Amendment. Does anybody happen to know what the 18th Amendment is? Bailey. Prohibition. Good. All right. So in the 1920s, in the United States, through Prohibition, alcohol, the sale, consumption, and distribution of alcohol was against the law. All right. Now, did that stop people from drinking? Absolutely not. No. So that almost kind of created like a kind of a market for it. People like Al Capone and others kind of made a nice living off of that. So in 1933, they had to add another amendment to the Constitution, the 21st Amendment, which repeals 18. All right. So that's the only. But again, same thing. You had to kind of go through this process of just basically kind of like passing an amendment to cancel out an amendment. All right, and again, we'll talk about the number of amendments, because on the Constitution test, there's going to be questions like what, based on almost like just memorizing numbers. Right, it's just kind of, that's unfortunately that's kind of how the test is kind of set up for the amendments. All right. Also, too, there's certain things that aren't necessarily in the Constitution, all right, but have become kind of what we call tradition. All right, and so one example would be the establishment of a cabinet for the executive branch. There's no mention of that in the Constitution per se, as it's by definition. Cabinet is basically kind of these guys people that advise the president. Right. Initially, there was 4 cabinet positions. You had Secretary of State, you had Attorney General, you had Secretary of Treasury, and something called Secretary of War, right, which has been replaced with the Defense Department. So now there's 16. All right, we'll talk about those more in detail when we get into the chapter on the executive branch. But the reason being is as time changes, there has to be a need for like kind of new cabinet positions to address certain things. Like, for example, the last cabinet position that was added was the Department of Homeland Security. That came as a result after the attacks in 2001 on September 11th. Right, the whole kind of Al Qaeda thing. So there was a need to kind of address this kind of global terrorism thing. So that's where kind of the Department of Homeland Security was kind of added. All right. So and also too, something that's been in the news: the number of Supreme Court justices. There are 9, but that's not specifically stated in the Constitution. So there's some debate on whether, like for Democrats, we should add if they get the control of the Senate next year and the presidency, whether they want to add more cabinet or more Supreme Court justices to kind of counteract the kind of the conservatives on the court. That's being debated. All right, and so what we see here is that by the adding of more cabinet positions and such, there's something that's kind of built into the Constitution called the Elastic Clause that it allows, and it's kind of vague in this sense. It allows for laws to be made that are necessary and proper, meaning with the changing times. All right, and so for example, our founding fathers could not anticipate air travel, right? However, as we get into kind of air travel and stuff like that, there needs to be kind of some regulation of that, make sure it's safe and stuff. So you have things like the FAA added. All right, that kind of falls under the Elastic Clause. Now, somebody who's like a constructionist kind of looks at the Elastic Clause as very, very something that should be used kind of limitless. There should be a limit to it. All right. Those who kind of argue that the Constitution is like how Jefferson said, laws are for the living, right? And so, like Jefferson had argued that for every 19 years, laws should kind of expire to a certain extent. All right. The Elastic Clause tries to kind of like change with the times, right? So we'll talk about that again when we talk about the legislative branch and such. All right, so that was pretty easy today, right? That was the last of the notes, correct? All right, so that's chapter 3 in a nutshell. We're going to move on Friday to chapter 4.